Overwatch has been around for the past 7 years, and while it's undoubtedly struggling right now, for a long time, it completely dominated the FPS genre, and while it definitely wasn't the most original concept, it nailed it so well that it just exploded as a game. But in 7 years, the game is still here, and there's really not a lot that competes directly with Overwatch. And honestly, this brings up a lot of questions, like where are Overwatch's competitors? Are there other games that are trying to fight Overwatch or coming out that will challenge Overwatch, or is everyone staying away from this specific genre for a few reasons? There's a lot we gotta cover. Let's break it down. First up, let's talk about what makes Overwatch unique in the first place. What even is this game? And it's a class-based first-person shooter that is also not a battle royale and much more of an arena shooter. So it's similar in concept to many of the high-mobility games of past, or the high-mobility shooters of past, like Quake, and it combines that with class-based elements. And it's very similar to a game that came out before it, Team Fortress 2. And Blizzard just basically took Team Fortress's concept and applied it directly to a new IP. Very similar in the idea, but different slightly in its execution. Blizzard took a much more hands-on approach with balance and changes and applying new content to the game, unlike Valve, which left for milk and never came back. In addition to that, Overwatch wanted to make you feel for the characters, so they developed stories and cinematics that made you learn and know the characters, and they put a lot of work into giving their characters identity and making you connect with them. So Overwatch was definitely very similar to Team Fortress 2, but it also did a lot of things that Valve was unwilling or just never did, and it caused Overwatch to become the biggest FPS period. But that doesn't really explain why 7 years later, there's not a direct game that is very similar to Overwatch. If the Overwatch or the Blizzard mentality of just taking TF2's concepts and improving it worked so well, and Overwatch has been on the decline and struggling, why isn't there a direct competitor now that is eating up all the share of people that are obviously interested in this type of game? I personally believe that competition will create better products, and one of the reasons I feel like Overwatch has declined so greatly is because there's nothing that directly competes with it. So let's actually run through some of the Overwatch competitors that either are very, very similar to Overwatch, or they mix up the formula dramatically, but they still succeed in a slightly different market. Now, we do got to talk about that TF2 again really quickly. It popped off recently due to the summer update. It actually got an update for the first time in a while. And yeah, this game definitely still has a community. But when we look at the numbers, it's just nowhere near the 20 million plus active users that play Overwatch compared to, you know, a handful, 100,000. It's just not even close. And this is just mainly because the game has just been hands-off for so long. It's a much older game. It's obviously aged slightly, even if it's still very, very fun. And really, it also doesn't dominate the Rule 34 genre, which I think is important. I'm just kidding. But all joking aside, I do think that it's just a game that had its time, had its dominance, but it's just been so many years that unless a revitalized version of TF2 came out, like TF3, then yeah, we wouldn't probably see a huge revitalization. By the way, Valve, you came back for Counter-Strike. You're doing Counter-Strike 2. Come on, TF3. Come on, TF3. Please, please. Now, another game that's a more one-to-one comparison is Paladins, a game that is just very similar to Overwatch, but really, this game never quite lived up to the polish that Overwatch has. It never had as big of a budget, as big of a studio behind it. It didn't have the huge budgets for lore and character design. And while it definitely did some things really solidly, some things even better than Overwatch did, it never really cemented itself as just a better quality game. It was always something that felt kind of like a knockoff. Even though some things that it did actually came out before Overwatch, it still felt that way. It felt like it was the Walmart budget version of Overwatch, and that kind of made it suffer. Even though it is an alternative, it has its own set of problems, and it was never just a clear-cut better version of Overwatch, even with all the problems that Overwatch faced. Now, there were several games that came and went, like Realm Royale and some other games, but they basically either died due to budgeting or poor balance or poor management or lack of interest, a combination of all these things. But there were a couple of games that took the class-based shooter genre and actually succeeded, even if they did it in a different way than Overwatch did. And number one was Apex Legends. This is a class-based shooter that not only combines the movement or the fluidity of movement into a shooter, but also does it with classes. But it did change up one fundamental thing, and this is a really important thing, and that's the way that you fight is Battle Royale. They introduced the new popular way to play games, the new popular shooter genre, the Battle Royale subgenre. They embraced it. And there are definitely a lot of people that love Apex, but the number one reason that Overwatch players don't like Apex is because they don't like the Battle Royale subgenre as a whole, myself included. While I do like the gunplay, I like the character aspect of the game, I like the skill expression, when I think about Battle Royales, I don't think of them as particularly that competitive, and the reason is because there's a random aspect into the game. Oftentimes, you do not have 100% certainty of loot, where enemies are, you could fight multiple teams at the same time, and it's never as controlled as the 5v5 in an Overwatch setting. So even though this game is definitely marketed to a certain group of people and very popular, I think there's a huge group of loyal Overwatch fans that will never ever transition to Apex purely because it's a Battle Royale, and Battle Royales aren't for everybody. In my personal opinion, I'm not the greatest fan of Battle Royales for a competitive game, but that's definitely a conversation for another day. But ultimately, while Apex did have success, it didn't eat up the core fan base of Overwatch at all. And of course, it has its own separate problems. Even if you look at it through its whole lifetime, it has done things relatively well compared to a lot of games that are live service. If you look at the game now, you could say that it's suffering just as many problems as Overwatch is, and that's really saying something. Now, the other game that blew up and grew immensely in the class-based shooter genre is Valorant. And Valorant took a lot of the core gameplay elements from Counter-Strike and applied the class-based elements over top of them. Now, this was made by Riot Games, who had the same level of backing that Blizzard did, if not more so, and they definitely put ample amount of resources into developing the characters, developing the polish, developing the lore and backstory and cinematics for the characters, and it definitely scratched that itch for many people that were looking for something a bit more hardcore than Overwatch was. But it still changed things in a way that wouldn't capture the core audience for Overwatch, because the way in which you fought was attack shooter. It was not like an arena shooter like old school Quake or maybe even Halo a little bit. It took things directly from games like Counter-Strike, where movement was punished and you had to be very disciplined and precise with the way that you took engagements. While it's much more similar to Overwatch in the consistent team battles as compared to Apex's Battle Royale, the movement couldn't be further from what Overwatch embraced. And for those who love Overwatch with how outside the box characters could get and how they didn't have to follow the gunplay elements of games like Valorant and Apex, you could make a character that shot beams, or a character that flew, or a character that did pretty much anything you could imagine. Or people that liked Overwatch because of the movement, the fluidity in movement, Valorant just wasn't really a game for you at all. So we have two games that were successful, but they never really captured the core audience for Overwatch. And I honestly think that they did this intentionally. I really don't think that any company wanted to battle directly with Blizzard. And this really kind of brings the whole conversation full circle. The reason that there hasn't been a true direct competitor to Overwatch is, number one, the only people that could produce something that has the high budget and polish that it takes to rival something like Overwatch would be a AAA studio. But when AAA studios decide to create a game, they typically want to do something that is actually slightly adjacent from what exists. While Overwatch is definitely a much closer resemblance to TF2 than Apex and Valorant is to Overwatch, I think that that was only possible because of how long ago TF2 came out originally and how the Valve team basically abandoned the game. They weren't really interested in competing anymore in this genre, so people still craved that gameplay loop, and Overwatch delivered that. But other games, if they go and compete directly with Overwatch, and then Overwatch does well, remember, game development takes a long time, they don't really have an idea of how good Overwatch will do over the next couple of years. Will it do very well? Will it do very bad? And they have to decide this way in advance when they start entering into this market. If they decided to do something that was too similar to Overwatch, Overwatch did well, and they didn't over-deliver on the comparisons between Overwatch, they could just get all their market shares eaten up, or even worse, no one plays their game and everyone just stuck with Overwatch instead. So it was far safer for these companies to make games that definitely would capture some percentage of the Overwatch player base, because obviously a huge part of the FPS community really are pining for class-based shooters, but they didn't want to do it directly one-on-one. Apex decided to capitalize on that Battle Royale trend, and Valorant actually decided to do something very similar to what Overwatch did, which is take a Valve game, which was Counter-Strike, and take that and copy the same gunplay elements, copy the same core gameplay loop. Yes, you're adding characters now, but it's the exact same core gameplay loop, and it all originates from Valve. And it's really interesting how both Overwatch and Valorant basically did the same thing as each other, both copying or borrowing core elements from the same studio, and they created a game that's successful. Now, that being said, unlike with Overwatch, Valve actually responded to Valorant's success with the Counter-Strike 2 announcement and the revitalization of this core game. And that's really interesting to me because something like that has not really happened to Overwatch. And I honestly think that because that is happening, Valorant will become a better game as well. Unlike the comparison between Apex, Overwatch, and Valorant, where these games don't directly step on each other's toes because the people that like each of these games like them for different gameplay loop elements, when it comes to games like Counter-Strike versus Valorant, they directly compete with each other. And I think that that is going to push both games to produce more, try more, add more. And yes, they have their own unique fan bases that are only going to like each game. But I think that that competition is going to breed both of the games to become better and better and better. And I really do think that Overwatch needs a very similar competitor that comes out, succeeds, and is actually a rival potentially to Overwatch, or at least something that people might leave Overwatch for if Overwatch starts to slip. And I just don't think anything like that is out right now. But if there was any game that I think could maybe have a shot, I would say Project Loki. Some of you might not have heard of this game, but they have a lot of Overwatch, Valorant, and Riot devs working on it, and I playtested this game under NDA, and yeah. This game basically checks every box for me as far as what I'm looking for in a class-based game. It's not a shooter, but it is something that is unlike anything that we've seen. It's not a MOBA. It's not a battle royale. It's like something different. And even though I'm really optimistic about that game, and I'll definitely be making videos on that on my second channel, I don't think that it will fully take in the entire fan base of Overwatch because it's not a shooter. It's not a first-person shooter. And that's the thing. I would love a direct Overwatch competitor, a game to come out that is a class-based first-person shooter that is well polished. But in order to create a game like this, it would require a huge amount of resources, a AAA studio, and it really looks like no one wants to directly clash with Overwatch. So it's pretty much up to one developer, Valve, pick it up, TF3. But all joking aside, how do you feel about Overwatch? Are you surprised that there's no direct competitors with the game? And if you had a studio make a class-based shooter, what studio would you want to do it? Let me know in the comments down below, and I'll see you next time.